Welcome to Our Montana. I'm Mike Penfold, your program host. Here, sitting on the Yellowstone River on a beautiful fall day, the colors are out. Looking across the river, in 1874 was the Crow Indian Reservation. I'm sitting in Itchkapee Park in Columbus. 1874, that was Indian country. The first immigrant, white immigrant, to come into this country was a chap by the name of Horace Countryman. And I've got two people that have really studied Mr. Countryman, Ralph Saunders and Patty Hooker. They're going to tell us about this first immigrant into this country. Maybe a scoundrel, maybe an entrepreneur, maybe a pioneer, maybe a homesteader. Who was this guy? You're going to find out.
Oh, that Horace Countryman, you mean? Oh my gosh, that old gentleman. Yeah, you've read a little bit about him too.
A little bit.
That seems like almost impossible that he was born almost 100 years ago. 1822. Then he was married in the 1840s and had two children, and then got a divorce. And then he went west, and then he came back again by the Isthmus of Panama, and then got married, and then went all the way back to California again, had more children, and then he moved north. He spent a little bit of time in Utah, and then went to Montana.
Well, Horace, I believe, did he not, at Murraysville, build some type of stamp mill?
He built a stamp mill there.
So he was pretty handy, wasn't he?
He was, and at Virginia City. He built the Masonic Lodge building. It's still there.
Oh, I'll be darned. Didn't know that.
That was one of the first buildings in Montana that was built.
And I don't know how involved putting a flour mill in. They had a lot of trouble with it, it sounds like. He was constantly repairing that. And then he helped survey for some irrigation ditches. So he was a pretty handy guy, even though he...
Yeah. One of the first ditches in Montana was at the first agency up there. South of Zorky, and that ditch is still there. His oldest child was born in the early 1840s with his first wife named Evelyn Stone, and then they only were married for just a few years. But his second child, I think, was born in 1842, 43, 44, somewhere along that line. That was Daniel, and it was interesting that those are the two children. Even though he didn't stay with that wife, those are the two children that actually ended up in Stillwater County with him. And Daniel used to do a lot of business with him. And Margaret married a person in California named Payne, and it was interesting. It was a different family, but it was a Payne that Horace had married. So by the same name, different families. And then but that gentleman died, Joseph Payne died in 1860 something, 1870. And so did Horace's second wife died. Elizabeth died in about 1870. So when he got down here, he had been divorced and also was single with never married again, and his second wife had died. But the two children were with him. Then Margaret Payne then married another gentleman from right here, and it was the very first marriage. It was in the court. It was in the hotel.
Quinn.
Yes, the very first marriage.
Frank Quinn.
Yes.
He also worked at the agency.
Correct.
Breaking horses, so
yeah.
Small world.
And then they had a child, a daughter that was 16 years old that had a disaster and died at the age of 16. And her, that was by her first marriage. So her name was Payne. Her name was Rosa Payne. She died at 16. And she is buried just north of Columbus in a separate little spot right there that they got alongside the road, and it says right there Rosa Payne on it. But then after he came into Montana, he spent some time at Virginia City and then in Belgrade area and Deer Lodge, and then he went north and he went up to
Well,
Flathead Country.
Flathead
right?
Agency.
Yeah.
He was a miller up at the Flathead Agency,
Yeah.
grinding flour
Well, he was quite a miller.
in the early 1872, 73, and then he found his way to Fort Parker, which was the first Crow agency, where they were, a Crow agency. It wasn't a fort like people think. It was they distributed annuity goods, and that's where the agent lived. And Horace continued to be a miller there. And shortly
he started to
thereafter,
open up a store too, didn't he?
Shortly thereafter, he moved to Benson's Landing, which was a settlement of not so good of characters in the country. There's several saloons in there, and Horace was one of them. Of course, this was off the Crow Reservation, but it was still illegal for traders to sell to the whiskey to the natives.
Right.
But nonetheless, they did. And it became quite a problem for the agents at Fort Parker. So, in their infinite wisdom, they decided to relocate the Crow further down country to the Absaroka Agency. But guess what happened? Those Confederates, quote, moved downstream.
And Horace, he jumped right on that. Didn't
Horace
he?
was one of the
he
first.
Says, I'm going to beat old Benson to the and so he moved down and opened up a trading post, and then even had that warehouse on the south side of the river on the reservation, which he shouldn't have had. And then that was pretty short-lived, because he had that license that he had got in 1875 and lost the license in 1875.
One of the Crow agents refused to give that unfit man, a man unfit to be in an Indian country, refused to give him a trading license.
And at that point, the only good thing they liked about him was he worked up at the agency to help build some of the buildings up there.
He was a miller up there, and his son was an engineer, and he actually tore up some of the ground for the farming purposes. And
so it was, so he had a little kind of some good sides and some bad sides. So he's pretty controversial.
He was an entrepreneur, and he was told, one of the agents was told he was a bad man. He and his son would have rig some horse races with the Crow, and poisoned one of the horses, and actually his son did die from a gunshot wound.
Yeah, from a family member.
Over a horse feud.
And a horse feud, and there was a girl involved too, I think.
Oh, sure, blame it on the girl.
Horses and girls. He made a lot of money, and for that particular time.
A lot of friends and a lot of enemies.
And a lot of enemies, I'm sure, but if there was anything that was money to be made at, he was involved, because he had a ferry, and he had a cable to transport people across the river. He charged money for, and eventually they put together and even had a bridge. They built that bridge, and at Columbus, it was the first bridge. And that lasted a few years, and then was sold to the state. But
and his hotel.
He also had a hotel
with oyster dinners and dances.
And it was a lively time. The issue in 1876, and he had a hotel then, and it was on the west side of the river. Then in 1877, the post office started, and they started the name Stillwater, and then it was the first postmaster was Horace Countryman, and then in 1878 there started to get a little bit more activity going. Then some other families moved in, like the Clausens. There was two Clausen brothers,
Dutch,
Gus and Dutch. Yep, and then at about that time, here come Mr. Benson again. Oh, Mr. Whiskey Dealer himself, and he started to come in there with the Clausen brothers, and they started a store less than a half a mile away from Mr. Countryman. Then, 1 year later, in 1879, then gentlemen by the name of Kaufman and Mittoff then started another store near the mouth of Kaiser Creek.
They were traders at the Crow Agency, at the
Right.
Zorka Agency.
And so they came down here to do a little more business
Yes.
themselves.
Yes.
Well, in the process, then they started making a lot of whiskey. And
Called
it didn't
Sheep
taste
Dip.
real good, so they nicknamed the place Sheep Dip.
Must have
And
been off.
then they had hotels and restaurants and dance halls and everything. I mean, it was building up real big. And Countryman was over there by himself, and he was kind of losing out because they moved the telegraph station right there, right at Eagle's Nest. They had a blacksmith shop, and that all shows on a map that was put out by the railroad company in 1882.
Oh.
Well, anyway,
That's
Horace Countryman decides that, hey, I'm getting beat out, and he's got word that this railroad's coming, so he then jumps over the top of those guys and starts at a brand new location, which is now, of course, Columbus. And he then built a hotel and moved the post office. So the post office really was all the way from the west clear to the east. The post office bypassed the Eagle's Nest. So Columbus really never was fully actually entitled at Eagle's Nest if you use the post office as being the title. And then in 1882, here comes the railroad, and I mean, things really start moving. And then eventually, it is short-lived life there for old Eagle's Nest. And then by 1894, they had a little conflict with the name, with Minnesota, Stillwater and stuff, so they renamed Columbus, instead of being Stillwater, as Columbus, moved the name and changed the name. And at that time, they moved also the depot from the east side of Columbus to where it is now. The building is still there. And unfortunately, Mr. Countryman's hotel was too far to the south on railroad property, so they had to relocate it. And that building was still there clear up in the 1950s.
It was a warehouse, was it not?
A gentleman by the name of Cole operated a little candy store on the east side of that building, and I can remember buying candy out of that building from them at noon. Boy, we'd go down there with a nickel and get all the candy you wanted. Well, it is kind of an interesting site, and I sure wish that this old building that was constructed by Horace Countryman and Hugh Hoppy, right? Old Hugh, that would have been maintained a little bit better over history. It goes way, way back. And I think, according to your book, he first got here in 1874, right? And yeah, when the agency moved or was getting ready to move, and he was trying to beat old Benson to the bluff, right? And so he came down here and decided that he would be the main trader. And so this is so-called the Countryman cabin that was like a warehouse, and boy, oh boy,
all that illegal stuff in
all
here.
that, yeah. It's something, isn't it, about the history of this thing. And I can remember when I was a kid, we used to go in here and play store, because we knew it was supposed to have been some kind of a store, and it had counters, and it had a place where there was a stove, and we used to get in here and play store when we were just little. And eventually, Grandma and Granddad used to store all their old magazines and stuff here. It would have been a jewel to get in here with those old early 1930s and 40s magazines, you know. That would have been also pretty neat. But now there's one thing that's missing. Here it is right here. Okay. I think they've just stuck it up. No, it was built there. But there was another one right here, and I've got a picture I'll show you. I want to take a picture of it to follow the history of that thing through, because this was one of the doors right here. It was one of the old doors right here. And from the time that I can ever remember this cabin, this door never operated. Why necessarily, I don't know. But the counter was along this side and across the back. And I don't remember any counters on the west wall. I don't remember anything on the west wall. I think there was tables or something there. But when we played store, when we were kids, we always would come in this door right over here. This was the door to come in. And this rock has been moved because that's the platform to come in. And they cheated with it. And he probably didn't use it 100% as a warehouse. He probably cheated a little bit. And probably when nobody was looking, he was trading alcohol.
We know that
when he shouldn't have been. Yeah, we do know that, don't we? But
so you were saying there was another door over there.
Yeah, this is the door we always used. This door was always boarded up somehow, but we never ever used it. I never ever remember it opening. But this was the wall that had the counters on it, and that's the wall that Grandma and Granddad, I can remember, used to have a lot of the old Post magazines and stuff like that. They'd bring them down here and store them here, so it became just nothing more than a storehouse for them. But
are there any windows in this?
There was a window in the front. There was no window on this side that I can remember, and no windows on the back that I can remember, or this side. But I think there was one window on this side that I can kind of recall. But we could look at pictures and be able to tell that too. But it's definitely looking worse every year. There's no doubt about it. And it's too bad that Granddad told them the wrong building when the people purchased the place, because they protected this other building that was right over there, and as being the Countryman cabin, and so they put a roof on it and protected it and everything, and then later on it burned, as well as that right over there. There was a building right up on that point over there, and it burned too. Okay, well, yeah, going back to Countryman here again, you know, even though that was the warehouse and where they were supposed to store the liquor, the illegal trading took place, and the Indians primarily camped in just past those trees in that little flat over there on the other side of the creek. That was the primary camping area. And it was interesting that how we found out about that is by a guy that homesteaded here in 1877, who was with Countryman earlier, ended up living his last days south of Absaroka, right close to the other at the agency, and my granddad met him up there, and so he told him all about the history of this area and everything. And so Granddad then found out what and why, how things happened, because he was here basically at the time that things were going on. So that is not written up in any books. It was just carried on from my granddad, from Alex Hundley that lived here. And so it's kind of interesting how some stuff transpires. It's a neat little place to stash a little bit of liquor that would have been away from the cabin, and just kind of out of the way, and that people wouldn't have seen it. It's well made. It's starting to show its wear, but a lot of dirt over the top of it now is built up. But it's amazing how well built it is, and it would have stored a few gallons of alcohol. They were not happy campers when Horace Countryman and Benson and anybody else was selling liquor to them. It wasn't the best thing to do. That really didn't make him a gentleman, doing what he was doing with the kind of the trading that he was. And that's the reason he lost his trading license too. Isn't that right, Patty? I believe that he had a trading license to trade in 1875, and he lost it in 1875. So they very well were on him pretty quickly as to what he was doing wrong. Probably 3 feet wide or thereabouts, but it's got really well-developed rock blocking all the way around. I mean, it's made very well. How deep it was, we don't know, because there's dirt in the bottom, and and I'm not sure that was the bottom. I'm sure it probably might have been a little bit deeper even. Well, this is the location on the north side of the Yellowstone River that Horace Countryman had his stage station set up on. And he also had a hotel there, and it eventually became a post office in 1877. 3 to 4 years later, he moved it down to the actual site of Columbus right now. But this was the site that he lived at for upwards of 4 years.
And then what happened in 1876?
Oh, yes.
The ride for his life.
It was quite an interesting episode. And that's why Jim Annan calls that, or him at least, an unsung hero. Because there was a young man that actually carried the news from the Custer battlefield, from the massacre that took place, all the way to the trading post, which was Countryman's on the west side of the Columbus West Hill. He arrived there with that news, and then there was a man by the name of Colonel Norton. And Colonel Norton wrote up some information based on his knowledge and put that together and gave it to Countryman. And Countryman, here he jumps on a horse. He gets to Bozeman. Telegraph wires are down. And then he gets another fresh horse and goes to Helena. So he had been riding for like 36 to 48 hours on a horse without even sleeping at night, and delivers the news to the newspaper people in Helena. They put out a late session of the newspaper, and then the telegraph wires sent the news out on the 4th of July, and it went nationwide, and newspapers carried that news on the 5th of July. And so the very first print to anybody in a paper was on the July 3rd. It went out. Then nationwide actually didn't come out in all the newspapers across the country until the 5th. But it didn't come out in the Bismarck News until the 6th of July. And they report that they were the first news. They didn't know. They were actually 3 days later from the very first news that had ever come out. So it was very interesting. But Horace Countryman, and all of the stuff that had ever been written on it, his name was never mentioned. And that's why Jim Annan wrote that little book called The Unsung Hero, involving Horace Countryman, who carried that news that went out nationwide. That was a long horse trek from Columbus to Helena.